Chapter 11. Christianity and Religion. Those who make religion their God will not have God for their religion. Thomas Erskine of Linlathen. I know I didn't say that right.
They'll forgive you.
Having eliminated the confusions which come from ignoring the relations of thought, imagination, and speech, we may now return to our question. The Christians say that God has done miracles. The modern world, even when it believes in God, and even when it has seen the defenselessness of nature, does not. It thinks God would not do that sort of thing. Have we any reason for supposing that the modern world is right? I agree that the sort of God conceived by the popular religion of our own times would almost certainly work no miracles. The question is whether that popular religion is at all likely to be true. I call it religion advisedly. We who defend Christianity find ourselves constantly opposed not by the irreligion of our hearers, but by their real religion. Speak about beauty, truth, and goodness, or about a God who is simply the indwelling principle of these three. Speak about a great spiritual force pervading all things, a common mind of which we are all parts, a pool of generalized spirituality to which we can all flow, and you will command friendly interest. But the temperature drops as soon as you mention a God who has purposes and performs particular actions, who does one thing and not another, a concrete, choosing, commanding, prohibiting God with a determinate character. People become embarrassed or angry. Such a conception seems to them primitive and crude and even irreverent. The popular religion excludes miracles because it excludes the living God of Christianity and believes instead in a kind of God who obviously would not do miracles or indeed anything else. This popular religion may roughly be called pantheism, and we must now examine its credentials. In the first place, it is usually based on a quite fanciful picture of the history of religion. According to this picture, man starts by inventing spirits to explain natural phenomena, and at first he imagines these spirits to be exactly like himself. As he gets more enlightened, they become less man-like, less anthropomorphic, as the scholars call it. Their anthropomorphic attributes drop off one by one, first the human shape, the human passions, the personality, will, activity, in the end every concrete or positive attribute whatever. There is left in the end a pure abstraction, mind as such, spirituality as such. God, instead of being a particular entity with a real character of his own, becomes simply the whole show, looked at in a particular way, with a theoretical point at which all the lines of human aspiration would meet if produced to infinity. And since on the modern view, the final stage of anything is the most refined and civilized stage, this religion is held to be a more profound, more spiritual, and more enlightened belief than Christianity. This description that he's giving here of religion, which when he uses religion, I haven't made clear to while reading this that the word religion for him here is in quotation marks most of the time. So I guess you'd call those scare quotes. The religion he's talking about here is really that he labels pantheism. That trail of religious history that he laid out is a very common one. People think, well, man invented these spirits. They had of course, he, like the Greek philosopher who I can't remember said, the man creates God in his image. You know, if animals could write, if they had opposable digits and they had an alphabet, they would describe God as looking like a horse or an oxen or a cow. And so this is what man did. Man made God in his image. He imagined the world full of spirits because there were things he could see happening that he couldn't explain. So he imagined them being done by things that he couldn't see. But those things he couldn't see, again, he imagined looking like himself. And over time, the anthropomorphic or man-like attributes of the spirits he imagined slowly dropped away. So the passions of man, or the personality of man, the human shape of man, drops away.
And you're saying it gave birth to the, and stop me if I'm wrong, but pantheism, that's the religion if you could call it a religion, that we get Zeus and Poseidon.
No,
Hades,
that would be polytheism.
Polytheism.
Pantheism is a god that permeates all things. Pan means all. Pantheism,
Mm-hmm.
a god that inhabits all things, a god where all things, we could rearrange that sentence. Instead of saying God is in all things, we could say all things are God. God becomes everything. And Lewis is describing or he's recounting a common history of religion that is widely believed by a lot of people. It's that the ideas that man had at the beginning of what God is or what God does, those things slowly dropped away to where we were left with a God that really had no real character, a God that really had no definition, no distinctness to him or her, or even have a sex at all. We refer to God with masculine pronouns. Some will refer to God with feminine pronouns. Many fewer will do that, but they'll do it nonetheless. Even a God that has no sex at all, that we can't even refer to in that way. So, because people often think in our modern times that because the latest evolution of something is the most enlightened or most refined version of something, sort of like technology is often that way, a newer car is better than an older one. In the same way, this view of God is better than the older ones that ancient man had. Back to Lewis here, he says, now this imagined history of religion is not true. Pantheism certainly is, as its advocates would say, congenial to the modern mind. But the fact that a shoe slips on easily does not prove that it is a new shoe, much less that it will keep your feet dry. Pantheism is congenial to our minds, not because it is the final stage in a slow process of enlightenment, but because it is almost as old as we are. It may even be the most primitive of all religions, and the orenda of a savage tribe has been interpreted by some to be an all-pervasive spirit. It is immemorial in India. The Greeks rose above it only at their peak, in the thought of Plato and Aristotle. Their successors relapsed into the great pantheistic system of the Stoics. Modern Europe escaped it only while she remained predominantly Christian. With Giordano Bruno and Spinoza, it returned. With Hegel, it became almost the agreed philosophy of the highly educated people, while the more popular pantheism of Wordsworth, Carlyle, and Emerson conveyed the same doctrine to those on a slightly lower cultural level.
Chris, Spinoza, we've talked about him many times. Not here on the show, but remind me.
Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher who rigorously critiqued the idea of a monotheistic personal God who tinkered with and personally interacted with the universe. The only God that he could really accept was the kind of God that Lewis is describing here. A pantheistic, impersonal, untouchable God. A God that is impersonal is the word, an impersonal God. This was the only kind of sort of all-pervasive spirit, the sort of permeating spirit that guides the universe, I guess, in a way, and you can talk about this God with a capital G, but this isn't the God that any sort of Christian would recognize. This is Spinoza, and this history that he's relating here, since, well, as far back as recorded history will go, is a history of that type of God. In India, even today, he says in India it is immemorial. The pantheistic, all-pervasive spirit type of God is immemorial in India. That is what their religions are based on, all of them. The Greeks, like he says, only really rose above that with Plato and Aristotle, and quickly went back into it once the Stoics came along after. The Europeans also had gods like this. The Germanic tribes, the Nordic tribes, all of these tribes had gods that were spirits that were all pervasive. They were pantheistic in the true sense of the term. Europe really only rose out of that, if you want to see it as rising out of that, and I think we certainly do, through Christianity. So, we're contending with this idea that pantheism is the more enlightened view of religion that we should all accept, because it's the latest view, because this imagined history of religion that Lewis recounted just in the previous page, or in the previous pages, said that man eventually, or man at one point started seeing spirits everywhere. He started sensing spirits everywhere. He imagined those spirits to look like him. Over time, those spirits in his stories and in his lore lost their anthropomorphic human qualities, their human form, their human passions, their human activities, and became what we see from many modern religious people, a all-pervasive, unknowable, impersonal God. A God that you can reference as a God, but that really isn't, certainly isn't a monotheistic God. And so he's contending with that idea and saying, well, no, that's not really the case. The pantheistic idea isn't so congenial to you because it's new and refined. It's congenial to you because you are habituated to it through hundreds of thousands of years of human thinking and human history. You are in the habit of thinking this way, not because you personally are, but because mankind is in the habit of doing that. Mankind is in the habit of seeing God as a pantheistic God. The monotheism of Christianity that's the novel thing. That's the new thing. And if we look at this from the standpoint of history, that's the new thing. That's the thing that doesn't quite fit. That's the thing that is that's the anomaly. Not pantheism. Pantheism is the norm. And that's what he's trying to relate to us here by saying, when we survey these cultures, the Greeks, the civilizations in India, the European civilizations, we find their pantheism as the norm, and any deviations from it as anomalies, not as some primitive idea of religion. Continuing on, he says, so far from being the final religious refinement, pantheism is in fact the permanent natural bent of the human mind, the permanent ordinary level below which man sometimes sink under the influence of priestcraft and superstition, but above which his own unaided efforts can never raise him for very long. Platonism, and that's an interesting point he makes there, because he says this pantheism is this thing above which his own unaided efforts, man's, can never raise him for very long. Well, what's he referencing there? The unaided efforts. Unaided by what? Well, in this case, he's talking about Christianity. Who attempted an unaided effort? Well, you could look at Plato and Aristotle, who certainly weren't Christians. They had never heard of Christ. Probably had never heard of the Hebrew religion either. And yet, they came out of the pantheistic perspective. Both of them did, and their successors came out of the pantheistic perspective. And yet this, Lewis is definitely referring to this when he's talking about it being an unaided attempt at coming out of pantheism. It doesn't last for very long. The Stoics quickly came back with a pantheism of their own, right behind the Platonists and the Aristotelians. He goes on and says, Platonism and Judaism and Christianity, which has incorporated both, have proved the only things capable of resisting it. It is the attitude into which the human mind automatically falls when left to itself. Pantheism, that is. No wonder we find it congenial. If religion means simply what man says about God, and not what God does about man, then pantheism almost is religion. And religion in that sense has, in the long run, only one really formidable opponent, namely Christianity. And there's a footnote here. It says, hence, if a minister of education professes to value religion at the same time takes steps to suppress Christianity, it does not necessarily follow that he is a hypocrite, or even, in the ordinary, this worldly sense of the word, a fool. He may sincerely desire more religion, and rightly see that the suppression of Christianity is a necessary preliminary to his design. I'm sure he's making a reference to the politics of his day, the the Minister of Education he's referencing here. I don't know who he's referencing, but here we have a person, a hypothetical person, wanting to someone who professes to value religion, and at the same time takes steps to suppress Christianity. Well, if pantheism, as Lewis has laid it out, is religion, in the historical sense of how man has conceived of religion, then this man really isn't a hypocrite or a fool. He could genuinely desire to suppress Christianity and genuinely, at the same time, value religion. Because religion, pantheism, you can switch those two terms out as far as Lewis is concerned in this talk. Pantheism and religion are the same thing. So he could value religion, read pantheism, while suppressing Christianity, and not be a hypocrite or even a fool. Modern philosophy has rejected Hegel, and modern science started out with no basis in favor of religion. But they have both proved quite powerless to curb the human impulse toward pantheism. It is nearly as strong today as it was in ancient India or in ancient Rome. Theosophy and the worship of the life force are both forms of it. Even the German worship of a racial spirit is only pantheism truncated or whittled down to suit barbarians. Yet by a strange irony, each new relapse into this immemorial religion is hailed as the last word in novelty and emancipation. Every time pantheism rears its head, tries to have a revival, it's hailed as a new thing, as a liberation and emancipation from the old ways, when really the old ways are pantheism. It's really a de-evolution back to pantheism. It's hailed as a novelty, as he said, and as the last word, but it's really a settling into a very comfortable zone for man, which is to think of God in terms of pantheism. That this native bent of the mind can be paralleled in quite a different field of thought. Men believed in atoms centuries before they had any experimental evidence of their existence. It was apparently natural to do so, and the sort of atoms we naturally believe in are little hard pellets, just like the hard substances we meet in experience, but too small to see. So that was a natural thing for people to think, that there were units of matter that were so small that they were like little balls, little pebbles, because we could see pebbles, we could see sand, we could see dirt, and that dirt is made up of tiny pulverized rocks and minerals, of course. But so it was natural to think that maybe there's things even smaller than that, and we just can't see them, and we'll call them atoms. The mind reaches this conception by an easy analogy from grains of sand or of salt. It explains a number of phenomena, and we feel at home with atoms of that sort. We can picture them, the hard pellets we imagine these atoms to be. The belief would have lasted forever if later science had not been so troublesome as to find out what atoms are really like. The moment it does that, all our mental effort, all the immediate plausibility and obviousness of the old atomic theory is destroyed. The real atoms turn out to be quite alien from our natural mode of thought. They are not even made of hard stuff, or matter, as the imagination understands matter at all. They are not simple, but have a structure. They are not all the same, and they are unpicturable. The old atomic theory is in physics what pantheism is in religion. The normal, instinctive guess of the human mind, not utterly wrong, but needing correction. Christian theology and quantum physics are both, by comparison with the first guessed, hard, complex, dry, and repellent. The first shock of the object's real nature, breaking in on our spontaneous dreams of what that object ought to be, always has these characteristics. You must not expect Schrödinger to be as plausible as Democritus. He knows too much. You must not expect St. Athanasius to be as plausible as Mr. Bernard Shaw. He also knows too much. The true state of the question is often misunderstood because people compare an adult knowledge of pantheism with a knowledge of Christianity which they acquired in their childhood. They thus get the impression that Christianity gives the obvious account of God, the one that is too easy to be true, while pantheism offers something sublime and mysterious. In reality, it is the other way around. The apparent profundity of pantheism thinly veils a mass of spontaneous picture thinking and owes its plausibility to that fact. Pantheists and Christians agree that God is present everywhere. Pantheists conclude that he is diffused or concealed in all things and therefore a universal medium rather than a concrete entity, because their minds are really dominated by the picture of a gas or fluid or space itself. The Christian, on the other hand, deliberately rules out such images by saying that God is totally present at every point of space and time, and locally present in none. Again, the pantheists and Christians agree that we are all dependent on God and intimately related to him, but the Christian defines this relation in terms of maker and made, whereas the pantheist, at least of the popular kind, says we are parts of him, or are contained in him. Once more, the picture of a vast, extended something, which can be divided into areas, has crept in.
Let me ask, would you say that some of the things that Lewis pointed out here, that the pantheists say are true, that we are, I don't know, a part of him?
Well, he's drawing a parallel between how the pantheist and the Christians both say some things that are similar to each other, and yet they are distinct, and they're important distinctions. That portion there where he says that the pantheist of the popular kind says we are parts of him or are contained in him. This is different from what the Christians say. The Christians defined this as this relationship between God and man as that between maker and made.
Mm-hmm.
God makes man. Man isn't part of God. Not in the sense we are part of God in the sense that a bookshelf is part of the carpenter because it's a creation of the carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
It's a piece of the carpenter if you want to think about it that metaphorically. But what the pantheist means when he says that we are part of God is something really different. The pantheist really means we are God when he says we're part of God. Because all things are really God. Even the evil that we witness, this is a huge problem with pantheism, even the evil that we witness is part of God. Because all things are God. And if all things are God, well then all things are God. Everything gets in.
See.
Right, so there's a real distinction here between how the Christian views this and how the pantheist views this. They say things that sound similar on first hearing them, but there are real distinctions. And they lead to dramatically different philosophical conclusions, too. He begins this long paragraph, by talking about how there's people often compare the adult version of pantheism that they've run across, because they run across this pantheism in adulthood usually, and the adolescent version of Christianity that they achieved or attained or took in or understood during their childhood. They were taught Christianity in their childhood, so they view Christianity as primitive and naive. They learned about pantheism as a young adult or someone in adulthood, so they view it as something refined and mature. But it's exactly the opposite, he says. And he's going through these distinctions and to explain that, comparing, juxtaposing Christianity to pantheism to show the differences between them. That one is extremely naive and unrefined, and one is just like the comparison between the atoms we thought we would find thousands of years ago, because people imagined atoms existed thousands of years ago, and the atoms we actually did find. He mentioned earlier Democritus. Well, Democritus is the one who is first that anybody knows about. He's the first one that posited the idea of atoms. And this is a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago. So The atoms he imagined he would find, if he could see them, were not the atoms we found at all. The atoms we found were much more complicated, right? And he mentions Schrodinger right next door to Democritus. Well, Schrodinger is one of the founding thinkers of quantum physics. He says we can't expect Schrodinger to be as plausible as Democritus. Democritus just imagined atoms to be these hard little pellets that were smaller than salt or sand, but they just weren't visible. Well, Schrodinger knows more, though, doesn't he? He knows more, so we can't expect him to be as plausible as Democritus. We can't expect him to be as simplistic as Democritus. He knows too much. In the same way, we can't expect St. Athanasius to be as plausible as Mr. Bernard Shaw, another pantheist. Athanasius knows too much. He has to write about Christianity and the relationship of God to man and the details of God in a way that is complicated. Just as Schrodinger has to write about the atom in a way that's complicated, because the atom is actually more complicated than we imagined it would be. And God is more complicated than the pantheist imagined he would be. You see the relationship?
Yes.
Back to Lewis, he says, once more the picture of a vast extended something which can be divided into areas has crept in. Because of this fatal picture, pantheism concludes that God must be equally present in what we call evil and what we call good, and therefore indifferent to both. Ether permeates the mud and the marble impartially, he says. That's what we were just talking about. The pantheist has to look at evil and good as indistinguishable. If they're really sticking to their guns, that is. Because if God is present in all things, then he's as present in the
darkest of moments.
The darkest of moments, in the nurse who's helping an old man in the latter days of his life, in a truly human and beautiful moment, and in Auschwitz. God's there too. Because God's part of all of it. The Christian has to reply that this is far too simple. God is present in a great many different modes, not present in matter as he is present in man, not present in all men as he is in some, not present in any other man as he is in Jesus. You see, we're already getting into details here. Pantheist and Christian also agree that God is superpersonal. The Christian means by this that God has a positive structure which he could never have guessed in advance, any more than a knowledge of squares would have enabled us to guess at a cube. So there's more dimensions to God. He contains persons, 3 of them, while remaining one God, as a cube contains 6 squares, while remaining one solid body. We cannot comprehend such a structure any more than the Flatlanders could comprehend a cube. But we can at least comprehend our incomprehension, and see that if there is something beyond personality, it ought to be incomprehensible in that sort of way. The pantheist, on the other hand, though he may say superpersonal, really conceives God in terms of what is subpersonal, as though the Flatlanders thought a cube existed in fewer dimensions than a square. At every point, Christianity has to correct the natural expectations of the pantheist and offer something more difficult, just as Schrodinger has to correct Democritus. At every moment, he has to multiply distinctions and rule out false analogies. He has to substitute the mappings of something that has a positive, concrete, and highly articulated character for the formless generalities in which pantheism is at home. Indeed, after the discussion has been going on for some time, the pantheist is apt to change his ground, and where he before accused us of childish naivety, now to blame us for the pedantic complexity of our old Christs and tangled trinities. Our cold Christs and tangled trinities. And we may well sympathize with him. Christianity, faced with popular religion, is continuously troublesome. To the large, well-meant statements of religion, it finds itself forced to reply again and again, well, not quite like that. Or, I should hardly put it that way. You ever notice that about discussions about God? We've done this many times, even tonight. Whenever you go to make a statement about God, whatever it is, you're always forced to pull back and go, I did it with the bookshelf, right? I said in the same way that you could say a bookshelf is part of the carpenter that made it. We don't mean that it is the carpenter. And even that doesn't get in exactly what we're talking about, because when we say God, that we are a part of God in the sense that we have a relationship between maker and made, this also leaves out something. We're always forced to pull back and say, well, not quite like that, or I should hardly put it that way in C.S. Lewis's inimitable British style. This is something that really seems to gall the pantheist, right? It seems to gall the pantheist because the pantheist longs for simplistic, general statements about God. And the Christian is always forced to say, not quite. Yes, but not quite. Or no, but maybe a little. And this is something that really galls the Christian. And I think this is what Schrodinger would be doing with Democritus, by the way. Right? Imagine Schrodinger sitting with Democritus, and Democritus is talking about atoms. And Schrodinger's like, well, yes, but there's more. Yes, but not quite what you're saying. Atoms are like that a little bit. Schrodinger is there to provide nuance. Schrodinger is there to provide details. Schrodinger is there to draw the borders around it and circumscribe Democritus' statements with something like reality. And that's what the Christian is always forced to do with the pantheist. He's forced to hem him in and go, God has a structure. He's not everywhere, and he's not he is everywhere, but he's not everywhere equally. He's present in all things, but not in the same way he's present in man. He's present in man, but not in the same way he's present in some men. We can think of Moses, Abraham, David, Isaiah. He's present in one man in a way that he's not present in any other man. Christ, Jesus. We're always forced to draw borders around this and say, you're running off too fast with this, pantheist. You've gone and you've taken the ball and you're running really fast with it. Hold back a little bit.
Gotcha.
This troublesomeness, Lewis goes on, does not, of course, prove it to be true, the troublesomeness of Christianity, that is. But if it were true, it would be bound to have this troublesomeness. So let's imagine this, Lewis says. What if Christianity were true? What if there was a monotheistic God that was personal and interacted with the universe? What exactly, would we expect that to be simple? It probably shouldn't be. It probably would need to be something complicated. Or at least more complicated than you wanted. Yeah. Maybe not complicated to the degree that nobody could understand it, but complicated to the degree that simple picture thinking wouldn't suffice to describe. The real musician is similarly troublesome to a man who wishes to indulge in untaught musical appreciation. The real historian is similarly a nuisance when we want to romance about the old days, or the ancient Greeks and Romans. I happen to be a little bit of a history buff myself, and I find that I'm not someone who's very fun to watch a history movie with. A period piece, we'll call it. Because I'm always like, man, these people would have stunk. You know, they got the Romans walking around, the Greeks and the Romans all walking around looking great. And
like modern day
Manhattanites, right? But you go, man, these people would have just, all I can think is the smells. My God, the smells. They would have been awful. So the real historian, and I'm not a real historian, I'm just somebody who likes to read history. The real historian is a nuisance to somebody who wants to sit around and romanticize about the ancient Greeks and Romans. The real musician, the one who actually knows how to play the piano or the guitar or the saxophone, is a real nuisance to the guy who wants to talk about music appreciation. He actually knows what he's talking about, right? The ascertained nature of any real thing is always at first a nuisance to our natural fantasies. A wretched, pedantic, logic-chopping intruder upon a conversation which was getting on famously without it. But religion also claims to base itself on experience. The experiences of the mystics, that ill-defined but popular class, are held to indicate that God is the God of religion rather than of Christianity, that he, or it, is not a concrete being, but being in general, about which nothing can be truly asserted. To everything which we are to say about him, the mystics tend to reply, not thus. What all these negatives of the mystics really mean, I shall consider in a moment. But I must first point out why it seems to me impossible that they should be true in the sense popularly understood. It will be agreed that, however they came there, concrete, individual, determinate things do now exist. Things like flamingos, German generals, lovers, sandwiches, pineapples, comets, and kangaroos. These are not mere principles or generalities or theorems, but things, facts, real resistant existences. One might even say opaque existences, in the sense that each contains something which our intelligence cannot completely digest. Insofar as they illustrate general laws, it can digest them, but then they are never mere illustrations. Above and beyond that, there is in each of them the opaque brute fact of existence, the fact that it is actually there and is itself. Now, this opaque fact, this concreteness, is not in the least accounted for by the laws of nature or even by the laws of thought. Every law can be reduced to the form, if A, then B. Laws give us only a universe of ifs and ands, not this universe which actually exists. And he talked about this earlier in the book. He said, there are lots of people who, objecting to the idea of miracle, object to it on the grounds that a miracle violates the laws of nature. We've been over this, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about this a lot. Now, he said earlier on in Miracles, he says, well, what do we really mean by that? Laws don't actually create anything. They don't create any action. The law of gravity or the law of arithmetic really doesn't, the law of gravity doesn't create bodies that fall, right? Mm-hmm. The law of arithmetic doesn't create any money. In fact, you can't even count the money until you've actually got some. The world is full of brute facts, things, hard substances, things that resist when you push against them, opaque realities, he terms them here, right? The laws don't actually create anything. And he says this is what we're left with. Laws give us only a universe of ifs and ands, not this universe which actually exists. What we know through laws and general principles is a series of connections. But in order for there to be a real universe, the connections must be given something to connect. A torrent of opaque actualities must be fed into the pattern. That torrent of opaque actualities, that torrent of opaque realities is what you view around you. What he listed as flamingos, German generals, lovers, sandwiches, pineapples, comets, and kangaroos. That's that torrent of brute facts that you're pressed up against. If God created the world, then he is precisely the source of this torrent, and it alone gives our truest principles anything to be true about. But if God is the ultimate source of all concrete individual things and events, then God himself must be concrete, and individual in the highest degree. Unless the origin of all other things were itself concrete and individual, nothing else could be so. For there is no conceivable means whereby what is abstract or general could itself produce concrete reality. So if God was this abstract thing, the pantheists claim for him, how is it that the universe came to be populated by so many concrete things? Things that aren't abstract, things that aren't diffuse, things that are hard realities, like the table you're leaning against, like the chair you're sitting on, like your body itself. These are hard realities. They're not generalities. They're not theories. They're not spirits. They're not metaphor. They're real. You can press against them. And if you try to press against something hard enough, you'll pay the price. So, in the form of pain or even death. So, how is it this universe becomes populated by so many hard and fast realities, while the God that this torrent flows from is himself just a generality? Bookkeeping, continued to all eternity, could never produce one farthing. Meter, of itself, could never produce a poem. Bookkeeping needs something else, namely real money to put into the account. And meter needs something else, real words fed into it by a poet, before any income or poem can exist. If anything is to exist at all, then the original thing must be, not a principle, nor a generality, much less an ideal or a value, but an utterly concrete fact. Probably no thinking person would, in so many words, deny that God is concrete and individual, but not all thinking people, and certainly not all who believe in religion, keep this truth steadily before their minds. We must beware, as Professor Whitehood says, of paying God ill-judged metaphysical compliments. We say that God is infinite. In the sense that his knowledge and power extend not to some things but to all, this is true. But if by using the word infinite we encourage ourselves to think of him as a formless everything, about whom nothing in particular and everything in general is true, then it would be better to drop that word altogether. Let us dare to say that God is a particular thing. Once he was the only thing. But he is creative. He made other things to be. He is not those other things. He is not universal being. If he were, there would be no creatures, for a generality can make nothing. He is absolute. He is absolute being, or rather the absolute being, in the sense that he alone exists in his own right. But there are things which God is not. In that sense, he has a determinate character, and also, if you want to get right down to it, limitations. Right? We say God can do all things. We even in the New Testament and the Old Testament we have something to disabuse us of that idea. God cannot lie. That's a limitation of a kind. It's a limitation of a kind, right? In Hebrews, we're told, quoting a passage from the Old Testament, that God can swear by nothing greater than himself. He says this to Abraham, I swear by myself that I will do this thing for you. Well, why does he swear by himself? Because there's nothing greater by which he can swear. We often swear by something that's above us, something that's higher than us, because we're trying to borrow its character. We're trying to borrow its reputation. We swear, as you can swear by on your mama's grave, right? And you can swear on something you think is greater than you, something sacred, something holy. God swears by himself to Abraham because there's nothing greater that he can swear by. So that's a limitation of a kind, right? So we can drop, he says we can, God is infinite, yes. If by that we mean that his power extends to all things, yes, that's true. But if by infinite we mean that he is everything, then it'd be better to drop the term infinite altogether and just not use it. So he says in that sense he has a determinate character, because there are things which he is not. There are things which he is, but there are also things which he is not. And so he has a determinate character, something fixed. Thus he is righteous, not amoral, creative, not inert. The Hebrew writings here observe an admirable balance. Once God says simply, I am, proclaiming the mystery of self-existence. At times, without number, he says, I am the Lord. So something specific, right? I am would seem to lend us toward the pantheistic God, wouldn't it? Because there's no definite character there. It's just existence, period. But he says, I am the Lord. I, the ultimate fact, Lewis goes on, have this determinate character and not that. This determinate character and not that. A distinction. I am the Lord. And men are exhorted to know the Lord, to discover and experience this particular character. These are not the statements that would be made about a pantheistic God. You can't know the Lord if the Lord is everything. The error which I am here trying to correct is one of the most sincere and respectable errors in the world. I have sympathy enough with it to feel shocked at the language I have been driven to use in stating the opposite view, which I believe to be the true one. To say that God is a particular thing does seem to obliterate the immeasurable difference, not only between what he is and what all other things are, but between the very mode of his existence and theirs. I must at once restore the balance by insisting that derivative things, from atoms to archangels, hardly attain to existence at all in comparison with their creator. Their principle of existence is not in themselves. In other words, they aren't causing themselves to exist, as God is. So he's trying to draw a distinction here. He says, yes, God is a determinate, distinct thing. He's not everything. And yet, just because I'm using these terms, and he says he's shocked that he's forced to use these terms, I want to make sure I clear the record here. That God is not like us in that sense. Because to call him a definite and determinate thing seems to lower him a little bit closer to our level. Because we're a distinct thing. You're Adrian and I'm Chris. And I'm not something else. I'm that. Whatever that is. You're Adrian and you're that. And you're not the shoe. You're not the rock. To lower God to, it seems to lower God when we talk about him as a thing that is this thing and not that thing. That he has a determinate character. But so he says, I want to restore the balance and say, now that I've said that, God is so much, is so different from the created things, the derivative things. You and I are derived from him. All things are derived from him. That the difference is not even conceivable. Right? So this is what he wants to reassert this. Their principle of existence is not in themselves. That's the biggest difference between derivative things and the creator. You can distinguish what they are from the fact that they are. The definition of them can be understood and a clear idea of them formed without even knowing whether they are. Existence is an opaque addition to the idea of them. But with God it is not so. If we fully understood what God is, we should see that there is no question whether he is. So understanding what we mean by the term God is to understand that he exists. To understand what God, to get a definition for what we mean by God is to understand that there's no way to say that he doesn't exist once you understand that definition. The defining of him is his existence is a priori to a definition of him. It would always have been impossible that he should not exist once we understand the definition of what he is. He is the opaque center of all existences, the thing that simply and entirely is, the fountain of facthood. And yet, now that he has created, there is a sense in which we must say that he is a particular thing, and even one thing among others. To say this is not to lessen the immeasurable differences between him and them. On the contrary, it is to recognize in him a positive perfection which pantheism has obscured, the perfection of being creative. He is so brimful of existence that he can give existence away by creating things, can cause things to be, and to be really other than himself, can make it untrue to say that he is everything. This is how brimful of existence he is. He can give it away in creation. He's so full of creative existence, so brimful of existence itself, that he can make it untrue to say that he is everything.
It is clear that there never was a time when nothing existed. Otherwise, nothing would exist now. But to exist means to be a positive something, to have, metaphorically, a certain shape or structure, to be this and not that. The thing which always existed, namely God, has therefore always had his own positive character. Throughout all eternity, certain statements about him would have been true and others false. And from the mere fact of our own existence and natures, we already know, to some extent, which are which. We know that he invents, acts, creates. After that, there can be no ground for assuming in advance that he does not do miracles. Why, then, do the mystics talk of him as they do? And why are many people prepared in advance to maintain that, whatever else God may be, he is not the concrete, living, willing, and acting God of Christian theology? I think the reason is as follows. Let us suppose a mystical limpet, a sage among limpets, who, wrapped in vision, catches a glimpse of what man is like. In reporting it to his disciples, who have some vision themselves, though less than he will have to use many negatives. He will have to tell them that man has no shell, is not attached to a rock, is not surrounded by water. And his disciples, having a little vision of their own, to help them, do get some idea of man. But then there come erudite limpets who write histories of philosophy and give lectures on comparative religion, and who have never had any vision of their own. What they get out of the prophetic limpet's words is simply and solely the negatives. From these, uncorrected by any positive insight, They build up a picture of man as a sort of amorphous jelly. He has no shell, existing nowhere in particular. He is not attached to a rock, and never taking nourishment. There is no water to drift it towards him. And having traditional reverence for man, they conclude that to be a famished jelly in a dimensionless void is the supreme mode of existence, and reject as crude, materialistic superstition any doctrine which would attribute to man a definite shape, a structure, and organs. This is sort of a comical way of looking at this. You know, the first limpet, this crustacean, is the Jesus figure, right? He's the figure that knows something of God and intends to communicate that to the other limpets. And he has disciples, and they don't have quite the vision that the Jesus limpet does, but they do have some kind of vision. So once they go to telling what man is like, because that's what this is about. They have a vision of man rather than a vision of God. They are forced to use only negatives, right? He doesn't have a shell. Man doesn't have a shell. Man isn't attached to a rock like limpets are. And from these, they construct what they think man to be. And also, you notice that they have a reverence for man, much like people that came after Christ had a reverence for God. And so, trying to imagine what God is, they only solely focus on the negatives and don't at all focus on his positive characteristics. The negative characteristics are things he is not. The positive characteristics are things that he is.
Could you give me some examples of some negative things that God is not?
God is not a man. There's one thing he is not, and this is explicitly stated in Scripture many times. God is not a man. God is not like unto the four-footed creatures, right? That's something that's said in the Old Testament. God doesn't lie. These are negative characteristics of God. They're things that he is not. Rather than focus rather than incorporate the positive characteristics of God, most, as you know, and sort of comically here, he says, what they got out of the prophetic limpet's words is simply and solely the negatives. He says that then there come erudite limpets, these learned limpets, these philosophical style limpets, who write histories of philosophy and give lectures on comparative religion, and who have never had any vision of their own. So these are the university types, the intellectuals, the academics who come along to enlighten us poor schlubs that are stuck in our fantasies and our traditions and superstitions. They come to enlighten us, right? And from this, they take the negative aspects of God and they say, well, what is he not? Well, we'll build our picture of God based on what he isn't. And like with the limpets, they come to conclude that man, because he has no shell, he's not attached to a rock, and he takes no nourishment because limpets rely on the water to to float things toward them, which they then grab out of the water. That he must take no nourishment either. So, you know, in a sort of comical way here, he says that they conclude that the highest mode of existence is to be an amorphous jelly that's famished and is attached to nowhere, right? And this is not at all what man is. You know, there's a lot more. Knowing what we know of man, we know there's a whole lot more to man than that. But if that was the only thing they focused on, the negative characteristics, this is the picture that they would build up of man, perhaps. He goes on to say, our own situation is much like that of the erudite limpets. Great prophets and saints have an intuition of God, which is positive and concrete in the highest degree, because just touching the fringes of his being, they have seen that he is plenitude of life and energy and joy. Therefore, and for no other reason, they have to pronounce that he transcends those limitations which we call personality, passion, change, materiality, and the like. The positive quality in him, which repels these limitations, is their only ground for all the negatives. So you see, you asked what are some examples of the negative qualities of God. Well, here's some listed in one sentence. He says, he transcends those limitations which we call personality, passion, change, materiality, and the like. God isn't material; He is spirit, right? He's not subject to these passionate whims that, say, people are, that we see in the polytheistic gods that are prone to anger and vengeance and lust. He's not prone to those passions. Those are negative qualities of God. He doesn't have them.
He's
now,
not
why?
like man.
Huh?
He's not like man.
He's not like man, and he's not like images of God that man would build up if left to his own devices. We see that with the polytheistic gods. These are gods that man built up. These are gods that man would create in his own image. If man was able, and it's been said, I've mentioned this before. It's been said that if animals could write, if they could pin things, that they would create gods in their image. Bears would make gods look like bears, and peacocks would make gods look like peacocks, and they would have peacock qualities, and they would have peacock behaviors. And this is what man did primarily with the polytheistic gods. These are gods that are really just little better than very, very powerful men. When we examine them, they cheat on their wives, they murder each other, they lie, they steal, they practice subterfuge. They're disingenuous. They're deceiving.
Why get hung up on why he's not like us?
Well, what do you mean?
I figured men would be more upset that we're not like him, right? Or is that what's going on?
What do you mean
here?
upset? We're not talking about being upset here.
Well, man is focusing. We're focusing on the negatives, right? How God is not like man. Why are we focusing on why we're not like him?
Okay, so this is actually what Lewis says here next. He says that it's because the men who had a vision of God, men like Paul, men like Peter, it's because they had a vision of God that was positive. In other words, these are the things that He is, that they could definitely say what He wasn't. Right? It's because they knew to some degree what He is that they could say for sure what He isn't. It's from, as he says here, the positive quality in Him which repels these limitations is their only ground for all the negatives. The nature of God, who He is, the positive aspects of Him, the things He is, for sure, these repel those things that He definitely is not. And so these men who came after Christ, direct disciples of His, it's because of their vision of God as a plenitude of something, a plenitude of creating, of inventing, of love, that they were definitely able to say what He isn't. He is not these things. He is these things. And it's from the fact that He is these things that we know He definitely is not those things. But when we come limping after and try to construct an intellectual or enlightened religion, we take over these negatives, infinite, immaterial, impassible, immutable, etc., and use them unchecked by any positive intuition. So our vision of God is built up only by the fact of what He isn't, rather than the fact of what He is. At each step, we have to strip off from our idea of God some human attribute. But the only real reason for stripping off the human attribute is to make room for putting in some positive divine attribute. In St. Paul's language, the purpose of all this unclothing is not that our idea of God should reach nakedness, but that it should be reclothed. But unhappily, we have no means of doing the reclothing. Would we have removed from our idea of God some puny human characteristic, we, as merely erudite or intelligent inquirers, have no resources from which to supply that blindingly real and concrete attribute of deity which ought to replace it. Thus, at each step in the process of refinement, our idea of God contains less, and the fatal pictures come in: an endless, silent sea, an empty sky beyond all stars, a dome of white radiance, and we reach at last mere zero and worship a non-entity. This is what you see in a lot of religions or ideas of God that are we could classify them as mystical or as mysticism. This worship of a god that simply that has no positive characteristics. That is, as he says, a non-entity. It's it's that feeling someone gets when they're standing underneath the sky and feel small beneath it, right? Um, um, the feeling one gets when they're standing beside the ocean when it's huge and large. This isn't any god with a characteristic. We end up worshiping something that actually has no positive characteristics when we do this. We end up worshiping a non-entity, Lewis says, something that doesn't have any borders, any boundaries. It's amorphous, sort of like the jellyfish that the erudite limpets had a vision of, right, or constructed.
Do you recall Schaeffer's definition of a mystic?
No, not word for word. No. And the understanding, Lewis continues, left to itself, can hardly help following this path. That is why the Christian statement that only he who does the will of the Father will ever know the true doctrine is philosophically accurate. Imagination may help a little, but in the moral life, and still more in the devotional life, we touch something concrete which will at once begin to correct the growing emptiness of our idea of God. One moment, even of feeble contrition or blurred thankfulness will, at least in some degree, head us off from the abyss of abstraction. Notice that. He says one moment even of feeble contrition, that feeling of guilt, feeble contrition, or blurred thankfulness, even if it's just a slight bit of thankfulness, is way more valuable and heads us off from heading into the abyss of, what does he call it here, the abyss of abstraction. Because if you're thankful, that requires an object. You have to be thankful for something and towards something, right? When you're contrite, when you feel guilty, you have to be guilty in the shadow of something. You can't just be guilty toward nothingness. You can't be guilty towards mere size and depth as you feel small before the size of the universe. Nobody feels, that's the thing about feeling small towards the size of the universe. Nobody feels guilty towards the size of the universe. They may feel small, they may feel insignificant, but they never feel guilty. You ever notice that? Nobody ever says I feel guilty as I stand under the night sky and look up at the Milky Way. They say they feel small. They say they feel guilty, or excuse me, they say they feel insignificant, but they never say they feel guilty. And that's what contrition is. It's the feeling of guilt, the feeling that there is a standard and I have failed to live up to it. That requires an object, positive characteristics, one that is something and is not other things, right? He says this is a lot more valuable than any of those other mystical sensations and heads us off from the abyss of abstraction. It is reason herself which teaches us not to rely on reason only in this matter, for reason knows that she cannot work without materials. When it becomes clear that you cannot find out by reasoning whether the cat is in the linen cupboard, it is reason herself who whispers, "Go and look. This is not my job. It is a matter for the senses." So here, the materials for correcting our abstract conception of God cannot be supplied by reason. She will be the first to tell you to go and try experience. "Oh, taste and see," is a quote from an Old Testament prophet. "For of course she will have already pointed out that your present position is absurd. As long as we remain erudite limpets, we are forgetting that if no one had ever seen more of God than we should have no reason even to believe him immaterial, immutable, impassible, and all the rest of it. Even that negative knowledge which seems to us so enlightened is only a relic left over from the positive knowledge of better men. Only the pattern which that heavenly wave left on the sand when it retreated." A spirit and a vision, says Blake, are not, as the modern philosophers suppose, a cloudy vapor or a nothing. They are organized and minutely articulated beyond all that the mortal and perishing nature can produce. He is speaking only of how to draw pictures of apparitions, which may well have been illusory, but his words suggest a truth on the metaphysical level also. God is basic fact or actuality, the source of all other facthood. At all costs, therefore, he must not be thought of as a featureless generality. If he exists at all, he is the most concrete thing there is, the most individual, organized, and minutely articulated. He is unspeakable, not by being indefinite, but by being too definite for the unavoidable vagueness of language. The words incorporeal and impersonal are misleading, because they suggest that he lacks some reality which we possess. Incorporeal means having no body, impersonal means having no personality. This seems to say that we have something that he doesn't. It almost seems to put us above him.
Interesting.
We have a body, we have a personality, and we think of these things as necessary and essential. Incorporeal, he is. He does not have a body. But this doesn't mean that he's less than us. It means that he's more. It would be safer to call him transcorporeal, transpersonal. Body and personality as we know them are the real negatives. They are what is left of positive being when it is sufficiently diluted to appear in temporal or finite forms. Even our sexuality should be regarded as the transposition into a minor key of that creative joy which in him is unceasing and irresistible. Grammatically, the things we say of him are metaphorical, but in a deeper sense, it is our physical and psychic energies that are mere metaphors of the real life which is God. Divine sonship is, so to speak, the solid of which biological sonship is merely a diagrammatic representation on the flat. So even the things we hold very high, like the relationship between father and son, which is a very powerful one, this is something that is in a minor key compared to it's a copy and a diluted copy of the real relationship between God the Father and God the Son.
Interesting.
And here the subject of imagery, which crossed our path in the last chapter, can be seen in a new light. For it is just the recognition of God's positive and concrete reality which the religious imagery preserves. The crudest Old Testament picture of Yahweh, thundering and lightning out of dense smoke, making mountains skip like rams, threatening, promising, pleading, even changing his mind, transmits that sense of living deity which evaporates in abstract thought. Even sub-Christian images, even a Hindu idol with 100 hands, gets in something which mere religion in our own days has left out. Better a god with a whole bunch of hands, something to be terrified of, than a god that's a non-entity. Better a god that is like Kali or a god that has several heads that lives on a mountaintop than this amorphous nothing that expects nothing of us and is so far from us there's no contact. We rightly reject it, for by itself it would encourage the most blackguardedly of superstitions, the adoration of mere power. Perhaps we may rightly reject much of the Old Testament imagery, but we must be clear why we are doing so, not because the images are too strong, but because they are too weak. The ultimate spiritual reality is not a vaguer, more inert, more transparent than the images, but more positive, more dynamic, more opaque. Confusion between spirit and soul, or ghost, has here done much harm. Ghosts must be pictured, if we are to picture them at all, as shadowy and tenuous, for ghosts are half men, one element abstracted from a creature that ought to have flesh. But spirit, if pictured at all, must be pictured in the very opposite way. Neither God nor even the gods are shadowy in traditional imagination. Even the human dead, when glorified in Christ, cease to be ghosts and become saints. The difference of atmosphere which even now surrounds the words "I saw a ghost" and the words "I saw a saint," all the pallor and insubstantiality of the one, all the gold and blue of the other, contains more wisdom than whole libraries of religion. If we must have a mental picture to symbolize spirit, we should represent it as something heavier than matter. Now, you can see what he's saying there with the difference between a ghost and a saint. If somebody said they saw a ghost, what sensation would you get? Terror,
Like a dark one.
Darkness, terror, fear, right? But if someone said, I saw a saint, completely different sensation comes over you. One of holiness, one of, if you believe them, that is, if you believe that they were reporting accurately, the sensation would be of contact with something even more real than you. The ghost is something less real than you. It's a wraith, something that should have physical being but doesn't. Its immaterial aspect has been separated from its material aspect. And so you're left with this wraith, this wisp of a creature. But a saint is more material. It's more solid. Right? That's the sense you get. And he says there's more wisdom here than in whole libraries on religion. Because you know when you hear those terms, when you hear the difference between ghost and saint, you know the difference. And this is the difference between God and man. God is not less than man. He's more. He's heavier. We can think of Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, where when the protagonist in that story goes to heaven, he doesn't know he's in heaven, but he knows he's in a place that is very different from where he's from, and everything in heaven is way more substantial than anywhere he's been. In fact, he is like a ghost in heaven to other people who see him. He is kind of shadowy. He is misty. He can't even pick up a leaf because it's so heavy. The grass is like needles to him. It's like nails because he is not heavy enough to bend the grass. He worries about raindrops falling because they'd be like bullets. That's how much heavier everything is in heaven. And if we say that we are rejecting the old images in order to do more justice to the moral attributes of God, we must again be careful of what we are really meaning. When we wish to learn of the love and goodness of God by analogy, by imagining parallels to them in the realm of human relations, we turn, of course, to the parables of Christ. But when we try to conceive the reality as it may be in itself, we must beware lest we interpret moral attributes in terms of mere conscientiousness or abstract benevolence. The mistake is easily made because we, correctly, deny that God has passions. And with us, a love that is not passionate means a love that is something else. But the reason why God has no passions is that passions imply passivity and intermission. In other words, that they can start and stop. There's a gap between them. There's an intermission. The passion of love is something that happens to us as getting wet happens to a body. And God is exempt from that passion in the same way that water is exempt from getting wet. He cannot be affected with love because he is love. To imagine that love is something less torrential or less sharp than our own temporary and derivative passions is a most disastrous fantasy. Again, we may find a violence in some of the traditional imagery which tends to obscure the changelessness of God, the peace, which nearly all who approach him have reported, the still small voice. And it is here, I think, that the pre-Christian imagery is least suggestive. Yet even here there is a danger, lest the half-conscious picture of some huge thing at rest, a clear, still ocean, a dome of white radiance, should smuggle in ideas of inertia or vacuity, emptiness. The stillness in which the mystics approach him is intent and alert, at the opposite pole from sleep or reverie. God isn't this resting, distant, disconnected thing. Whenever the mystics, when he's saying the mystics, he's not meaning it in the way we were just talking about it in a negative sense earlier. He's meaning the wise men of the past. Whenever they approached God, they did it with heightened attention and alertness. You can think of Moses. You can think of Samuel. You can think of the high priest approaching God. They didn't do it as though they were approaching a sleeping giant. They did it as though they were approaching facthood itself. They are becoming like him, Lewis says. Silences in the physical world occur in empty places, but the ultimate peace is silent through very density of life. Saying is swallowed up in being. There is no movement because his action, which is himself, is timeless. You might, if you wished, call it movement at an infinite speed, which is the same thing as rest, but reached by a different, perhaps a less misleading way of approach. Men are reluctant to pass over from the notion of an abstract and negative deity to the living God. I do not wonder. Here lies the deepest taproot of pantheism and of the objection to traditional imagery. It was hated not at bottom because it pictured him as man, but because it pictured him as king, or even as warrior. The pantheist's God does nothing, demands nothing. He is there if you wish for him, like a book on a shelf. He will not pursue you. There is no danger that at any time heaven and earth should flee away at his glance. If he were the truth, then we could really say that all the Christian images of kingship were a historical accident of which our religion ought to be cleansed. It is with a shock that we discover them to be indispensable. You have a shock like that before in connection with smaller matters. When the lion pulls at your hand, when something breathes beside you in the darkness. So here, the shock comes at the precise moment when the thrill of life is communicated to us along the clue we have been following. It is always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry. It's alive. And therefore, this is the very point at which so many draw back. I would have done it myself if I could, and proceed no further with Christianity. An impersonal God, well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads, better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap, best of all. But God himself, alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, king, husband. That is quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who have been playing at burglars hush silently. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him. We never meant for it to come to that. Worse still, supposing he found us. So it is a sort of Rubicon. One goes across or not, but if one does, there is no manner of security against miracles. One may be in for anything. I couldn't stop reading this and comment on it because I felt like it needed to be read in total. Lewis is talking here about a living God. The difference between a living God, a God who really is, a God who really demands something, a God who really loves, and a God who has not just personality like us, but trans-personality, more than personality, living personality. This is a much different thing, and it's a God that very, very few people want. It's probably a God that nobody wants, because it's a God that terrifies. It's a God that awes. It's a God that demands respect. It's a God that demands fear in the good sense, right? Not fear like you have of a rattlesnake, but fear that you have of a righteous and holy Father, a Father that deserves your respect, that is competent and loves you. It's that kind of fear. You don't want to disappoint. You don't want to fail under his gaze, right? This is a very different kind of God, and Lewis is like, this is a God we really don't want, which is a God. It's why you see so many people reject that sort of God and ultimately embrace a God that's a mystical, pantheistic God, a God that's everything, because a God that's everything demands nothing. A God that's everything has no claim on your behavior. A God that's everything has no distinction.
What are some everyday examples of, things a mystic would say?
Our thoughts and prayers are with you. That's a common one. You hear it a lot from politicians. And I'm not saying every politician that utters it is someone who is a pantheist. But phrases like that are shapeless. There's no edges to them.
You're calling them platitudes.
There are platitudes, yeah. They're platitudes, they're weak, they're substanceless. And, maybe that's the particular realm of the politician. This is what they're good at. They're good at uttering platitudes. But there are, even I'm praying for you can be a platitude, even if it's not coming from a politician. It's, what do we mean by God? What do we mean by that? Is it just is it the truth with a capital T? Is it reason with a capital R? What do we mean by God? Is it a living being that demands something from us? That's the most objectionable God of all, because it's the God that won't leave you alone. It's the God you owe something to. That's why he says a little bit of contrition, a little bit of thankfulness keeps you from that abyss of abstraction. I keep coming back to that. It keeps you from that abyss of abstraction because it focuses your attention on an object, on the positive characteristics of it. Why be thankful? Why be contrite? It's there in a minor key, but it's there.